Hey guys, I thought it'd be fun to do a video about brands and how they intermingle with each other, what brands own each other, what brands kind of work with each other, who builds for each other. These kind of videos are always fun because it's a great way to see how this industry stays alive and also grows. The first one we're going to talk about is Guitar Center. They are a huge corporation and they own some other brands that you might know, like Music and Arts and Musician's Friend. Music and Arts is one of the largest chains of kind of a mom and pop style vibed brand that does band orchestra and lessons. Now, when you go in there, it does definitely have a much different vibe than Guitar Center, but it is owned by Guitar Center. Musician's Friend, of course, we all know them. They're one of the largest online retailers. Now, my understanding is they don't really intermingle too much. In other words, you don't see a whole lot of kind of Guitar Center operating the other two businesses. They seem to run all independently of each other, but of course owned by the parent brand. Guitar Center also has some in-house brands. Now, in-house brands are products that are owned by the store. So of course they'll get a bigger margin because they own the brand. They don't have to pay a manufacturer. Mitchell Guitars is one of their brands, and it's named after Wayne Mitchell, the original founder and owner of Guitar Center when it started out. Not only do they own Mitchell, they also own Acoustic, a brand that they brought back to life by buying the name and putting it on new products. And they also own Raven amplifiers. Now, they're not alone. Sam Ash is another large retailer that has its own line of brands and subsidiaries. One of its brands that are really predominant is, of course, Michael Kelly. They just acquired that brand and it is doing really well for them. But they also own Carlos Rebelli and Guitar Research, which you don't see too much of the Guitar Research anymore. When I go into Sam Ash, I definitely see the Michael Kelly and the Carlos Rebelli lines that are their in-house brands. Again, it's a way for them to make a little bit more profit and give you a little bit more value for dollar.
If you notice I left out Harkey and Samson, that's because Samson owns Harkey, and Samson is part of the Sam Ash brands, but it's not an in-house brand. It's sold other places and it has its own identity.
Next up, we're going to talk about a biggie, Gibson, because as we know, Gibson just came out of bankruptcy and they shedded off some companies. Now, of course, they kept the Gibson brand, they kept Epiphone, and also Steinberger and Kramer guitars. Other brands they own are Tobias basses, Slingerland drums, Maestro guitars, which is really just a kind of a low-end kind of import thing that they put into box stores and kind of sell it as more like a first act. It's a really just like a lower version than what Epiphone is. Although some of the guitars I picked up are pretty good, the majority of them, of course, are student grade instruments. Another brand they own is Harmony Central, and of course you might remember them if you remember before YouTube reviews, you used to go to Harmony Central for reviews. Now, of course, when we talk about big, you can't leave out Fender, which is FMIC, Fender Musical Instrument Corporation. That is the parent company of Fender. Fender is used more as a brand and less as the entity of the name of the company. FMIC owns a lot of companies, but they keep some brands dormant, or I like to call them shelved. Some of the shelved brands are Brand X, Tacoma, and Sun, but actively they own Bigsby, Squier, Charvel, Jackson, and Groove Tubes. Now keep in mind, they have licensing deals with EVH and Gretsch guitars. They don't flat out own those two brands, but they do control the sales, marketing, and distribution of those products.
Godin is a large guitar manufacturer that manufactures Lartz and Lutherie, Siegel, Norman, LaPatre, and Simon & Patrick, just to name a few.
They are one of the largest manufacturers of electrical instruments and acoustic instruments in Northern America. Another big company, which of course has been around for a very long time, is PV Electronics. Now, PV Electronics is an interesting brand because it uses a very old business model that is still effective to this day, which is to own multiple brands that cover different categories. So in PV's world, they own PV, which will make electric guitars and amplifiers, but then Trace Elliot, which makes their high-end and bass amp line. They would have Buddha amps to do their high-end guitar amp line, Crest Audio to do PA systems, and Acoustic Composite to do high-end acoustic guitars. So it's a really interesting platform. This is really common, especially during the 90s, where a lot of companies thought, let's diversify by having multiple lines of products, so when dealing with a retailer, they can kind of one-stop shop it. So a lot of times when you see PV in a store and you see those other brands, that's what's going on. I get this one all the time. People ask me, is this Schecter and LTD or ESP the same company? And the truth is, yes and no. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Schecter Guitars and ESP Ltd, which also owns Edwards, is two separate different companies. But another separate company is MI, Musicians Institute, which we all know is in California, which has GIT, BIT, But more importantly, I think the rumor always is that they're the same company because they do have the same owner. But I want to explain this for a second. You can own a company or a majority of interest in a company and not necessarily connect those companies together. So in this case, there's one owner that owns all of those brands I just mentioned, but they're all held separately. They don't interact. I think that's where the rumors come from. He is the owner on record of those brands, but again, they're all held separate. Another interesting thing is when brands kind of change. This is a story of a brand change. You guys might know the name Strymon, but you might not know the name Damage Control. Damage Control was a line of pedals that had tubes in them, and they were really nice but very large. And for a short time, distributed by PV Electronics. Not owned, just distributed by PV Electronics. Unfortunately, Damage Control was never able to get a really big market share. So they created a new product line called Strymon. Strymon is Damage Control. It's a perfect example when a company kind of reinvents itself. A pedal company that really was focusing on a tube-driven pedal goes to being one of the best digital effects units around. That's pretty cool. Larger companies buying up smaller companies is nothing new to any industry, but we see it a lot in our industry and it has really interesting effects. A lot of times for the better, sometimes for the worse. This company is definitely for the better. Yamaha Music, which makes a great line of instruments from everything from band orchestra to drum sets to pianos to guitars, has now acquired Line 6 and Ampeg. Now this is really important because these are two brands that I think were very important to the industry, but maybe at some point we're floundering a little bit. And I think Yamaha has definitely made improvements with both those lines, especially in the Line 6 products. A couple years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of Line 6 products I was interested in. Now between the Helix and the wireless systems, I'm impressed. So I think there's sometimes a big improvement when a bigger company puts some resources behind some smaller companies. Now, a really interesting change in the industry is domestic outsourcing. We're all familiar with the term outsourcing. It's where they send manufacturing to other countries that have cheaper wages. But that's not what's going on in these cases. Back in the 80s, we would call this ghost building, but it's something beyond that now. One of the companies I think that's really streamlined and really made this a really interesting thing to talk about is Boutique Amp Distribution. Boutique Amp Distribution is a company that owns a few brands, but mostly works with a ton of brands that we know and like. They give these companies resources, like having manufacturing in the US that's reliable and more affordable, but more importantly, resources to do R&D by crossing over with other brands. If you're not familiar with Boutique Amp Distribution, let me give you an example of some of the companies that they own and distribute for. Tone King Amplifiers, Synergy Amps, Egnator, Soldano, Bogner Pedals, Friedman Amplifiers and Guitars, Wampler Pedals, Abasi Pedals and Guitars, and Matthews Effects, just to name a few. Now this arrangement is very interesting because I don't want to give the impression that these companies are owned by that Boutique Amp Distribution, because that's not exactly how this works. Like I said, some of this is just a commercial kitchen. These manufacturers have Boutique Amp Distribution build their products. Some co-build, in other words, like Bogner, they build their own amps, but they have the pedals made at Boutique. There's all kinds of arrangements. It's really interesting, but more importantly, you're seeing really cool things. Like, for instance, you can have Brian Wampler help Abasi design his pedal, or Dave Freeman help Brian Wampler design his amp. I'm really excited about this because I own a lot of these brands already, and I really enjoyed them. And I think that's because they were able to achieve something bigger than they could if they were just by themselves. Before we go, I thought I'd give you some changes to maybe the last video I did on this, which was Jam Industries has acquired a lot of brands, those being US Music Corporation, KMC, and Davin and Hanser. If you're not familiar with those brands, Davin and Hanser owns Custom with a K and Jay Tercer. US Music Corporation has Randall, Washburn, Oscar Schmidt. They currently own Parker, but not developing product. This is a really interesting thing because this is a big house full of products. So I'm really curious to see what happens with that in the future. A lot of times, a lot of brands get shelved and some brands get kept going. I think they own Jens Benz as well, and I don't think that product's being developed at this time. There are products that definitely will succeed from arrangements like this, and of course some that will be put away and suffer from it. We'll have to see what happens. Time will tell. Another interesting change was Apsara Audio, and I might be saying that wrong, but they own Pigtronics, and they acquired Supro, and I thought that was really interesting because I have a Supro and I love it, so I can see where they've really improved the line of amplifiers. And for fun, I thought I'd let you guys go with just some really fun company connections that I think are interesting. Warwick owns Warwick, Rockboard, Rockstand, and Framus. Hoshino owns Ibanez and Tama. BB Sound owns BB Sound and G&L.
Marshall Amplifiers owns Natel Drums and Eden Bass Amplifiers.
Korg owns Vox and Korg. World Music now owns Diamond Guitars and Amplifiers. And on the ghost building side, you have companies like Fano making Strandberg in the USA and Acacia making Vola in the USA. Well, there you have it. I thought this would be a fun video. It's not really to expose anything or anything like that. It's more just to show you guys how companies connect and how they work out. Of course, companies buy other companies. Now, keep in mind, there's a dozen companies I didn't even mention that necessarily don't own other companies, but they have new ownership in and themselves. Everything from Heritage Guitars to BC Rich have changed hands just recently. So the industry is always changing. This is how it survived. This is nothing new. Don't take this as a sign of the distress in the times. This was happening back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Every decade has had a huge changeover in our industry. It's how companies survive. It's how companies change. It's just what happens. But I thought it was fun to give an update. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like this video, don't forget, you can always give it a thumbs up or share it with a friend. And as always, I want to thank you so much for your time. And until next time, know your gear.